Hey everybody. Hope you had a great holiday season, and it's almost February, but I hope the new year is going well so far. Been kind of busy. Wanted to get back into the groove of things and go over a tutorial today on keyboard shortcuts. I firmly believe that keyboard shortcuts are probably the most important thing when you learn any sort of software. I think it changes how fast you can work and how you use the software, and it makes new software that much more enjoyable to use. I think that if you go through this project file, which took me quite a while to make, and practice these exercises, it's really going to improve your speed, and you're going to find yourself making scenes a lot faster, a lot quicker, and being able to do more with your hours in the day. So because Notch is a real-time software and so quick, a lot of the burden ends up falling on the end designer, which is you. And when you're on site with a client, knowing your keyboard shortcuts, knowing your way around the software, being able to do things quickly is really going to make the difference in making your client feel like they're getting their money's worth, and making you feel like you really know what you're doing and being able to more quickly explore options or get to a result. So I highly recommend you download this project file and kind of follow along, or practice on your own time. So before just diving straight in, obviously the Notch manual has a whole list of shortcuts here. There are some minor errors and things that don't necessarily work anymore, as well as some new things that they haven't quite added yet. So I went ahead and made my own version, and I also kind of rearranged them into categories that I find to be a little bit more intuitive. I'll share this with the project file in a package so that you're welcome to, also go through this, and you can kind of compare and contrast, see what's different, see which one you like more, or even format this the way that you see fit, print it out, put it on your wall, memorize it basically. In terms of this code here, I kind of use these three boxes to demarcate your mouse. So this left box filled kind of means like a left click, the middle box is a middle click, and the right box will be a right click. And I kind of like separating these Control-Alt-Shift keys into columns, but I also included the regular write-up as well. I also go through and combine some things a little bit, just so this list is a little shorter and a little easier to read. So instead of actually listing out 1 through 9, I kind of just combine them and say switch cameras. So things are going to be a little bit different. I'm sure Notch will also update their shortcuts soon. Supposedly a release should be coming where you can actually define your own shortcuts, but it's always good to know the defaults. So take a look at this before you start. It's a good guide and gives you kind of an overview into what each of these group sections in the project file will go over. One thing that I actually was surprised by as I was making this tutorial in this project file is that I learned some shortcuts I did not know existed. So it's always good to review this, even if you think you know all the shortcuts. I bet you'll be surprised by a couple of the ones that I discovered and added into here. So yeah, here we go. So this is a pretty large Nodegraph project file. There's a lot of comments where I write out the shortcut and explain how you could practice it with some of the examples that I've made here. For each of these kind of sections that you see on the shortcut list, I've turned them into groups here. So you can see we start with general, and then we'll jump into Nodegraph, Viewport, Timeline, Keyframing, and finally the curve editor. So when you're going through and practicing this, I recommend you ungroup things so that you can kind of do this section, and when you're done, you can group it back up or delete it or whatever you want to do. So first, it's really general basic things like F1 is the Nodegraph view, which is this view that we're currently in. So jump to Nodegraph panel, this current view. F2 is your timeline. So if you hit F2, it'll take you to this timeline view. If you hit F3, that will take you to the curve editor, which we'll play with later. F5 is node settings. So on your root node, this will open up kind of your layer settings. And if you select any node, F5 will let you rename it. So this one I've named Rename Me. You can try that out and see what it does. F8 is to capture a screenshot. So if you press F8, there's no kind of dialogue that tells you what happened, but it'll save a screenshot to a folder of your choice. So for me, my folder is in Documents, Notch, and then Notch Screenshots. That's the default, I believe. So you can see here we just saved a screenshot. If you don't like that directory, you can change it by going into File Preferences, and your directory is right here. I also have changed my default from BMP to JPEG, as I find that's just easier to open and transfer to other softwares afterwards. So feel free to change your screenshot directory there. F9 is to render full screen. What that means is it will just take over your entire monitor as so. And if you hit F9 again, it'll let you exit full screen and bring you back to your standard layout here. F10 is to render full screen on a second monitor. I don't have a second monitor, so I can't show you, but you'll have to trust me in that it works. F12 is to open the units, grids, and guides. I actually don't use this that often, but you can change how often you have these sort of grid lines on your timeline, as well as what your values are and your display FPS. So by default, because Notch is made in the UK, their default FPS display is 25, and it'll show 25 frames for every second. In the US, we use 30 or 60, so you can change this to better suit you if you prefer, for instance. That's general, pretty straightforward, really simple stuff, honestly, for navigating around. Let's look at next the node graph and how we can do certain functions here with nodes. So I'm going to ungroup this. So control left click is the zoom on your node graph. So if you hold down control and then drag left or right, it lets you zoom in and out. Same with up and down. I prefer left and right, but you can use whichever you prefer. Alt left click is kind of to pan around this viewport. You can also use the middle click on your mouse if you prefer. I use a Wacom Tablet, so the alt left click is definitely the way to go. I'll show you the Wacom Tablet setup I have a little later. I actually prefer it and I find it a little faster than a mouse. If you are unable to use that function on your mouse or on your keyboard, you can also use these little icons up here to do that same function of panning and zooming. The key A lets you center your viewport view on a selected node. So if I select this comment and hit A, it'll center on this comment, or if I select this null over here, it'll center. So you can try kind of selecting different things and hitting A to center your view on the node. Next is Shift A, which will actually zoom you into that node, as you can see. So if you're like zoomed way out and you know this is the node you want to see, you can just hit Shift A and it'll jump you way in. And that's kind of useful if, say, your node is sort of expanded like this and you want to make a connection really accurately. You can hit Shift A and immediately really precisely select an input. So that's Shift A. Control E is what activates your node search here on the right. So instead of kind of moving your mouse over to start searching for a node, you can also hit Control E and then start typing. So a good way to practice is think of a node that you want to place, then try to place it without actually using your mouse at all. So if we want to place a null, we can type in null, use the arrow keys to navigate to it, and if you hit enter, it will place a new null for you on your node graph or whatever node you have selected. It's a good way to quickly add nodes rather than having to use your mouse all the time. Shift left click is kind of a new function. It lets you drag a node along with all its children. So if I have a parent here with multiple node children connected, when I normally drag this parent, it moves on its own. But if I hold down Shift and then drag, it'll move the whole group. So instead of having to, say, drag a rectangle and select all and then move it, you can just hold down Shift and move the whole thing. Control Shift X is a cut node with all the child nodes. So you're probably familiar with Control X, which you can use to, cut and then paste a node again with Control V. Similarly, you can use Control Shift X to cut that whole system as you saw and then paste it again. So instead of having to, select them all and then cut and paste, you can also use a keyboard shortcut to do it. Control Shift C is a similar thing in that it copies a parent with all its children rather than just the node that you have selected. So if I try that out, I can paste a bunch of nodes after selecting just the parent node. So that's pretty cool, right? And I'm gonna go ahead and cut that away, kind of like delete it. Control D is kind of a new shortcut as well. It lets you duplicate a node. So instead of having to hit Control C and then Control V, you can just do it in one shortcut now with Control D. Really handy. Also works with multiple nodes. So if you select two, you can hit Control D and it will copy them. I use that shortcut really heavily. Control 1 is to enable or disable. I think it used to be Control H is to hide. And you have to hit Control Shift H to unhide it or make it active again. You can also use Control 1 instead as a toggle, which my left hand just finds a little easier to reach on the keyboard. The Control H and Control Shift H is useful though if you have, say some that are disabled, some that are enabled, and you want to affect them both in that you want to disable both of them even though one is already disabled, the Control H method gives you a little more control, because if you use Control 1, it'll kind of toggle and flip both of them. So different ways of disabling and enabling. Control G is to group nodes. That's kind of the shortcut that I use to group these sections. So you can select two nulls and group them with Control G. If you want to ungroup them, you can just select the group and hit Control Shift G and it'll remove that group for you. Control R is also a relatively new shortcut. It lets you connect a node to the root automatically. So instead of having to zoom out, drag a connection from the root to this new node I've added, you can just select your node and hit Control R. And the really cool part about that is it works with multiple nodes as well. So if I say disconnect these two nodes here, I want to connect them to the root again, I can select both of them and hit Control R. So really handy. Select multiple and left click lets you connect multiple nodes at once. This isn't really a keyboard shortcut, but it's relatively new and I think it's really useful as well. Say you have a parent node that you want to connect to 3 children node. Instead of drawing one connection at a time like this, you can actually select all of your children, just connect the first one with all of them selected, and it'll make a connection to all 3 of them. So really nice if you have a whole bunch of nodes to link up. That shortcut that I used just there to disconnect it is also not technically a shortcut, but I think it's really useful. If you hold down Control and Shift and then hover over connections, normally they'll turn yellow, but with Control and Shift, they'll turn red. And what that means is when it turns red and you click on it, it'll disconnect that connection from whatever it is connected to. So if I have, say, these 3 nodes connected here, and I change my mind, I want to undo it, I can just, instead of disconnecting them one by one like that, I can actually hold down Control Shift, and once they all turn red, I can click once and it'll disconnect all of them. So really handy shortcut there as well. One that I forgot to kind of list here, but is also a good one, is if you're connecting multiple things, you can hold down Shift actually. And instead of having to normally, start from this and draw each line, you can actually make multiple connections in a row while holding down Shift, which is really handy if you need to make a bunch of connections at once selectively. So also a great shortcut there. Disconnect that and reset it. I'll group this back again, since that's most of the shortcuts that I use on this Nodegraph system. And let's look at the viewport here. So I'm going to expand this viewport just a little bit so you can see a little more. And some of the shortcuts here I found really useful if you're the kind of user that prefers to navigate and move things around in your viewport visually, then these shortcuts will help you out quite a lot. So Alt F lets you focus your viewport origin on a selected node. So if you're in the orbit camera, which I am, normally you can orbit around things. You can change the center of your orbit by selecting an object or a node, so the sphere red, for instance. And if you hit Alt F, it'll actually center your orbit view on that. So it's a really great way to quickly jump to an object you have selected and be able to orbit your camera around it and see what's going on. So there you have it, Alt F. Switch back and forth. The numbers 1 through 0, or 1 through 9 and then 0, switch between cameras. There are a couple default cameras that aren't necessarily nodes that exist, but are views that you can view your notch scene from. So 1 is a perspective view, and 2 is the left side view, so along the x-axis here. 3 is a top-down view, so bird's eye view. 4 is below, so I guess like viewing from underneath something. 5 is your orbit cam, where you can hold down Alt and orbit around things. And then 6 through 9 become your user cameras, like I've labeled here. The hierarchy horizontally and vertically that you place them in matters. They'll get arranged left to right or top to bottom. So here's camera 6, 7, 8, and 9. And then 0 is your currently playing camera. So if you have multiple cameras in your timeline and you're cutting between them, 0 will play whichever camera you have kind of first in this arrangement. So if I move these cameras around, you'll see your currently playing camera kind of changes depending on the order and the hierarchy that you have these arranged in. Control left click is to camera zoom. So if I'm in my orbit camera and I hold down Control, you can drag to zoom in and out towards your object. Up and down is the same thing, so that's consistent with your Nodegraph navigation. Alt and left click is either camera rotate or orbit. So if you're in orbit view, it will orbit around your object. And if you're in camera view, it's going to kind of look left, right, up and down. Alt shift left click is to pan along the X and Z. So if I hold down Alt and Shift and drag, you see I'm moving along this kind of ground plane here. Alt Shift right click is to then move on the Y axis. So as you drag that, it lets you move up and down, whereas the left click moves around. So that's a way to kind of move your orbit view if it's not going to center on an object specifically. Alt G is to toggle this grid here. Sometimes I find it pretty useful for getting a visual handle on where you are in the scene. So if you hit Alt G, it turns that on and off. Tab or Shift Tab changes your gizmo mode. And what the gizmo is kind of like handles for you on the viewport to change the position, rotation, scale of any object. So if you select a null here, like this cube, and I'm going to Alt F to center on it, the default gizmo that you see is this positioning, so you can change the position of this object. If you hit Tab, you'll notice it changes to a rotation, and your icon here is also scrolled to the next one. So this is your rotation control now, right? If you hit Tab again, it gives you T, which is your scale. And then if you hit Tab one more time, it gives you Y, which is a uniform scale. So this scale mode lets you scale the axes independently, whereas this scale mode lets you scale the whole thing uniformly. And if you don't like the Tab and Shift Tab system of navigating through these controls, you can also use E, R, T, and Y. So E is position, R is rotation, T is scale, and Y is uniform scale. I believe ERT is also a common system in other 3D softwares, so that's a common way that you can quickly jump between gizmo modes. Control Tab is an interesting function that I was actually not aware of before kind of going over it. It lets you change this gizmo between 3 different spaces, between your parent, your local, and your world coordinate spaces. So this is really interesting because if you select this cube here, that's the child. Right now we are in P for parent coordinate space. So these coordinates are aligning with this null, which is the parent of your cube. So you're going to be moving this cube along the axis that this parent is oriented, since we've moved it and rotated it a little bit. So if I rotate this null here, you'll see what I mean. If I rotate the bank slightly, our cube axis has now changed on this gizmo because it's aligning with the parent. If you hit Control Tab, it'll change it to local, which is the orientation of our cube itself here. And if you hit Control Tab one more time, it'll use your world axes, which will always align on X, Y, and Z. So this is a great way to like move your object along specific axes, whether it's your parent, your local, or your world. So be conscious of that, and it might give you easier adjustment of your object in your viewport. So that's it for most of the viewport stuff. I'm going to group this back up and move on to the next thing. So let's look next at the timeline. I'm going to ungroup this. So left and right, bump your playhead here, as you can see in the very bottom left, forward and backwards by the frame. So if you hit the arrow key once, it's one frame, and it's really easy to navigate this way frame by frame. Shift left and right, which is the next one, jumps you by the second. So as you do that, you'll notice that you jump 1 second each time you do that. So those in combination are a really great way to kind of quickly navigate your scene to a really precise spot. The home key brings you to the beginning. So if I hit home, it's brought me back to 0. And if I hit end, it'll bring you to the end of the layer, which is currently set for 30 seconds, basically. So those are quick ways to kind of reset your scene and play it. If you are somewhere in the timeline, you need to quickly jump to the start, just hit pause it and hit home. Control and scroll is a way to zoom on the timeline. So if we hit F2 and go to the timeline view, you can zoom your time here by holding down Control and then scrolling up and down. A new shortcut, one that I actually requested, I'm really glad they added for me, is using the brackets to trim your in and out time on a layer. So for instance, we can take this null here, and if we switch to our timeline view, you can drag your playhead. Actually, if you hit F2 again, it'll hone in on your node here. That's also a cool little shortcut. If you hit F2 twice after you select a node, it'll actually bring your timeline view to your selected node. So really good for finding something quickly. Back to the bracket shortcut though. So if I want this in time, instead of dragging this and trying to align it, I can move my playhead to where I want and just hit the start bracket one time, and you'll notice it trimmed to right there. Similarly, you can trim the out point by hitting the out bracket, and it'll trim your null there. So that's really useful when you want a layer to start and stop at a very specific point. It's also really useful if you say extended your layer time. You can select multiple nodes and use those same shortcuts actually. So if I want to reset this, I can hit home, hit the in bracket, and then hit end and hit the out bracket. And you see I've just reset that null in and out time to be the same length as my layer. And that's it for timeline navigation really. Seems simple, but those are extremely useful as you go through and start using timelining. So next up is keyframing, and the shortcuts we just learned with timelining tie in very closely with a lot of these keyframing shortcuts here. So if you select a node and press Ctrl-Alt-C, it will copy all these attributes here, and it lets you paste them into a different null. So if I select this node and hit Ctrl-Alt-C, I can then select this other node, which is at defaults, and then hit Ctrl-V, and you'll notice it's just changed all these attributes to match the one that I just copied from. So pretty handy for kind of taking a different null and applying some attribute system that you like to that. Alt-R is a way to reset a specific attribute to default. So you can pick an attribute you want to reset, and if you hit Alt-R, it'll reset that to its default value. Or if you want to reset multiple, you can select, drag like that, and then you can reset them all at once. So you can use Enter to set keyframes if you don't like auto keying. I think by default auto key is on. I normally turn it off because I like confirming before I enter a keyframe. You can select this null over here where I've added a keyframe just at time 0. And if you use Shift arrow key to jump forward a couple seconds, you'll notice it turns yellow, which means it doesn't have a new keyframe. And if you hit Enter, or if you select this attribute and hit Enter, it'll let you place a keyframe without you having to go and click this K button. So if you're kind of scrolling along and adding more keyframes, you can keep hitting Enter and adding keyframes. So if you look at our timeline here, you'll notice we just added 3 keyframes there. Shift Enter inserts a keyframe for all keyed attributes at the current time. So if you select this null here, you'll see we have multiple keyframes that are placed at time 0. And if you jump forward and want to place a keyframe for all of those, you can hit Shift Enter, and you'll notice we just dropped a keyframe for all of those attributes. Control Enter inserts a keyframe for all keyed transform attributes. So it does it for all keyed attributes, but only the transform ones. So you'll notice that these 4 keyframes are on the transform properties, and these 2 are not. So if we jump forward an amount of time and then hit Control Enter, you'll notice it places a keyframe under transforms, but not these other attributes. Control left and right is a really handy shortcut to jump between existing keyframes. So if I select this jump keyframes and I do Control left and right, you'll notice I'm jumping between 2 keyframes. The first one's at 0 seconds and the second one's at 5 seconds. And if we look at our timeline view, you'll see here that I'm easily jumping between 2 keyframes. Control C is a way to copy keyframes. So you can go into into this copy keyframes node over here, and if you select position X, you can copy that and then paste it onto a different attribute. So if you have a set of keyframes that you really like, this is a great way for you to change or to add those same keyframes to another attribute. I recommend you typically keyframe envelope modifiers rather than these directly, and it'll be even easier for you to relink these sort of things. But that's it for kind of keyframing shortcuts. And then finally, we have our curve editor here. And this is probably something that scares a lot of people, the curve editor. But I think it's really important to make yourself familiar with it, because that's how you make a better animation in motion. So Alt left click or middle click is to pan, just like on the Nodegraph. So if we switch to our curve editor with F3, you can move around this view by holding Alt and dragging. You can also use your middle click to do that. Control Alt left click is a way to zoom in and out on your curve editor. And the The tricky thing is if you hold down Control and Alt, dragging left and right zooms you in time, right? Whereas dragging up and down zooms you in value. So you can use these in combination to kind of fit your frame to what you want to see. So if you use Alt to pan and then Control Alt to kind of zoom, you can zoom your value until you can better see what is going on. And same thing with time. So it's a little cumbersome. I think it could use a little bit of tweaking to get smoother from the Notch team. But for now, I find Control Alt and dragging is the best way to do that, to get around. Control left and right is just like with keyframes. You can jump your playhead to the previous or the next keyframe. So if I select this node with curve editor fun, I can quickly jump between these two keyframes here. Alt left and right is a way to bump an existing keyframe backward or forward one frame at a time. So if I select this keyframe at 5 seconds and then hold down Alt, I can move this keyframe in time with left and right. And then with Shift up and down, you can actually bump the value of the keyframe up and down. So if I hold down Shift here, I can increase or decrease the value. The Shift up and down is what's considered a minor unit, or 0.1 in this case. If you don't hold Shift, you can bump up and down by a major value, which in this case is 1. So using these in combination, you can really easily change the timing of your keyframes as well as the value. And I think a little exercise to play with that is you can see if you can change the keyframes in this node to what I've specified here without using your mouse at all. And that's the end of the keyframes that I had going here. And that's pretty much everything that I have seen so far from Notch. But for now, I think this is a really good start. If you can memorize all of these, I guarantee you your Notch creation speed will improve drastically. I guess the final bit is my Wacom Tablet. So I can show you what it looks like and how I like to use it instead of a mouse. So this is my Wacom Tablet. I prefer it to a mouse and I find that I'm faster with it now. This is the Intuos small version. They also make a medium and large, and there's actually a newer model out. You know, for anyone who's thinking about trying it, I highly recommend it. I don't go back and use a mouse at all anymore. I use one at work as well, this Wacom Tablet. And for going between like Illustrator, Photoshop, other programs like that, it's really handy. Simultaneously, if you suffer from any sort of carpal tunnel syndrome like I was from using a mouse every day, this has completely solved all of my symptoms from carpal tunnel and wrist pain, since it lets my wrist sit at a more natural angle. And overall, I just like the feeling of holding a pen, you know, and feeling like I'm writing rather than using a mouse and clicking. So I highly recommend it for anyone who wants to try it. Really, I think you should just go for it. This is Kramer. If you've been thinking about trying a cat, I also highly recommend it. It forces you to take lots of breaks. That's it for this tutorial. Thanks for watching. I hope the keyboard shortcuts have been helpful, and really have to go practice them and make them become muscle memory. And then when you don't have to look them up anymore, that's when you know you've really mastered the sort of keyboard shortcut speed workflow. I'm probably missing a couple small shortcuts, and I'm sure there will be more added as we go. If there are any that you know of that have been really helpful to you that I didn't cover here, please throw a shout out, mention it, share it with the community, and everyone can benefit from that. Otherwise, happy notching and see you next time.